Hey there, it's Silver. This is Diablo 4. Yeah, finally decided to take a look at it. ARPGs are a genre that I've always been into since I was a little kid, including games like the first Diablo, of course, and some other stuff like that. So I was interested in it, but I just hadn't actually tried it yet, and I am definitely a fan of the previous Diablo games, especially Diablo 2, but I wasn't a massive fan of Diablo 3, although luckily I would say this game is actually closer to Diablo 2 than it is to 3 in a lot of ways. It's still not 2, right? That game is still separate. This is an entirely new game, but if I was to choose one Diablo game that this was the most similar to, then I would say definitely the second one. Unfortunately, they are using Diablo 3's always online DRM kind of scheme, so yeah, unfortunately you do have to be online to play this game. I really do not like that, so I figured I would go ahead and voice that right from the start of the video, because I'm just not a fan of always online systems like this, and I think this game would work perfectly fine offline, but hey, that's just me. So in this case, you've got 5 different classes to choose from, some of which are some Diablo 2 favorites actually being brought back. So you've got a barbarian, a rogue, a sorcerer/sorceress, a druid, and a necromancer. And the footage that you're going to be seeing in this video is from my necromancer character. I do plan on making a sorceress and a barbarian to try them out, and honestly I might try out a druid too, because the game is, in my opinion, fun enough to actually warrant playing through multiple times like that, and the classes are definitely very, very different from each other, which we'll get onto in a little bit. But as for right now, I've only had time to level my necromancer. So mechanically speaking, every class is definitely very different from every other class. They've gone the route of giving every class its own specific mechanics, and I don't just mean its own skills and stuff, which obviously every class has, but I mean its own kind of unique mechanics alongside those skills. Like for instance, the necromancer of course gets its minions, and you can choose between 3 different types of minion for each of the 3 different minion slots, which are warriors, mages, and golems, and each one has 3 different upgrades, or well, I should say technically 2 different upgrades that you can switch between, and then 1 sacrifice option, which is some sort of powerful passive boost to your necromancer themselves, but it makes it to where you can't summon that type of skeleton anymore. So you can kind of mess with how your army works, and if you want to play like a solo necromancer with no army at all, you can actually do that. And while leveling, you have a skill tree in this game. It's kind of like a skill path, really. Basically, the skill tree consists of clusters of skills that each have a certain theme, and then once you put enough points into one cluster, the next one opens up, and so on until you get down to the very bottom, where you find your ultimate skills, which you can only choose one of, and your big keystone passives, which you can also only choose one of. So those are your sort of late leveling choices to make, like all the way up to level 33, I think you'll generally be, in order to find the last passive. There is, of course, a lot of leveling to do beyond that. Once you hit 50, you'll unlock the Paragon board, which is a different sort of skill tree that's a much more wide open kind of thing that is just smaller incremental improvements bit by bit. As you level up past 50, you will unlock this sort of, it's almost like a prestige tree, you could think of it as, basically. Small improvements that will build up over time to accentuating whatever specific build it is you've decided your character to do. And your main skill tree itself is split into different slots, basically. So you can put any skill in any slot. You're not limited like in Diablo 3, but you have a very limited number of slots. I feel honestly too few. I would like to see 8 instead of 6, but you do indeed have 6 slots. And you have your basic attack skills. So these are the things that cost no resource at all that you can spam. This is going to replace whatever basic attack your weapon comes with as soon as you level up to like 2. So you're going to choose a basic attack from various different ones, and then you have your core skills, which are your sort of main bread and butter resource using skill, the sort of big thing you bust out to do a lot of damage quickly and things of that nature. And then beyond that, you've got various class specific skills, like for instance the necromancer has curses and some other defensive skills, and then eventually some minion related stuff and things of that nature. And this of course is going to change for every character, but this means that you are going to be somewhat limited to what different kinds of skills you can choose from at first, because you're limited by the cluster of skills that you currently have access to. So it'll be a dozen or 2 dozen levels before you really unlock most of the tree and enable you to actually mess around. But luckily, respecking is incredibly easy in this game. All you do is right click on a skill and it will automatically refund the points. And of course you can only refund points that aren't needed for other points, so you can't say for instance refund a skill that you've modified with other skills. You've got to refund them in order, but still at any time you can refund skills as much as you want and get your points back and then put them however. So you're encouraged to experiment and slosh your points around here and there to see what you like. And the characters themselves seem to have quite a bit of different build variety within them. There's a lot of different skills to choose from, and the fact that you can only have 6 of them does get a little bit of a sort of tactical sense. As much as I would prefer to have more slots than that, I do have to admit that the smaller number of slots means your build has to be more tactically considered, basically. You know, you have to specialize in something specific in order to make the most of it. One really big change that I was honestly not quite sure about at first is the open world. This game actually has a fully contiguous open world in it. It is not the traditional ARPG different sets of zones that are all in their own loading screens. In this case, the world itself is one big map, and it is definitely big. It takes a long time to cross, and it has a lot of different biomes and stuff within it, so it is at least full of content. And although at first I wasn't sure if I was going to like this because I really enjoy the traditional like zone-based method of action RPG progression. I think it works really well. It's been used as the de facto standard for decades, and it does its job. But I do actually quite like the open world in this game. I think it is going to have some problems with replayability, and that some people are going to get a little bit more tired of traversing the open world, because in a more zone-based action RPG, you can get past certain levels very quickly and not have to go back to them. But in this case, since all of your characters are going to be all in the same world, you all have to travel the same roads and stuff like that. So you might get kind of tired of certain areas of the open world, but it is at least large enough to be full of different opportunities and things if you're willing to look around. As you explore, you'll find various kinds of towns and settlements and camps and things that often have waypoints in them for fast travel purposes. You can also eventually get a horse so that you can move around the map faster. That takes a little bit of time to get depending on what order you do the different quests in, because the main quest is quite a wide open thing. Each quest line works in a specific order, but you don't have to do each quest line in a specific order, if that makes sense. Like, once you've locked yourself into one, all of the quests in that line happen in the same linear order every time, but every other main quest line you can also do that in pretty much whatever order you want. So the world isn't exactly gated by level, and yet it also kind of is. It's a little confusing. It levels with you, so there is level scaling in this game, something else that I was very unsure about because I tend to not really like that very much, but I think they actually use it okay. Because it's an open world, you can't necessarily have certain parts of it be crushingly difficult compared to other parts of it, but at the same time, I like the way they've done it because it isn't just the world is always exactly the same level as you are, because in my opinion that's quite boring when that happens. And instead they've made it to where different zones have a sort of level threshold, so they're not all one level, they are like level 35 to 40 or whatever. So this means you can still go back to previous areas that once gave you trouble and clap all the enemies because you're higher level than them, but this also means that you can stumble onto something that's more difficult and a higher level than you are, which is how I prefer it, because I like to find extra challenges like that and go out of my way to face harder stuff. So I'm glad that the level scaling in this game isn't clamped so tight as to give you no choice but to always face things exactly your level. I like the fact that there is some variance there. Even though I'm still not a huge fan of level scaling systems in general, I do have to admit that the way this game does it is actually alright. There are loads and loads of things that you can find as you're exploring throughout the world, including dungeons, of course. There are lots of dungeons to face, and these are often pretty cool. There are a lot of different tile sets to come across, so they don't get old very fast, and they often have a lot of different possible objectives as well. Some of them are just a simple kill everything on this floor to move on, while others might have you finding certain artifacts and bringing them to pedestals, but these artifacts are going to be, guarded by very powerful elite enemies and things of that nature in big rooms. So this means the dungeons, you're not doing the same thing over and over in every dungeon, but it is of course still a dungeon crawler. It's an ARPG, so you're doing mostly combat in this game. The bosses are pretty cool because they actually have thresholds on their health gauge that show you where their different phases are going to transition. Some bosses don't really have much of a transition and mostly fight the same way throughout their entire health gauge, and the transitions mostly mark the time when they might do something else for just a minute or drop some extra potions for you or something of that nature. And other bosses, though, they have entirely different mechanics depending on which of their health gauges they're on. So I do like the fact that the sort of phase thresholds are actually marked on every boss, because they're not always the same. For some bosses it's a very obvious like 50% mark, but for others it's not necessarily that simple. So I do approve of that system, and I like it when bosses are multi-phase and thus more interesting. As another benefit, besides the experience and loot that you'll find from clearing a dungeon, every dungeon also has a first-time clear bonus, which is some sort of, usually it's an enchantment that you can put on like legendary weapons to improve them. A lot of them are specific to individual classes, which means not all of them are going to be useful for your character, but it does mean that the ones that you do find that are useful for your character tend to be very powerful and often have some really neat build-defining effects. So it's an extra reason to seek out these dungeons and actually do them aside from just the XP and the gear and stuff, because you can actually get unique rewards tied to those dungeons that involve being able to enchant your gear to do something specifically awesome for you. There are also these world events you'll sometimes come across. They'll have like an orange circle on the minimap that shows you the sort of bound you need to get in order to participate, and these can be done by multiple players. You can do them on your own, they're usually soloable, but if there are other players nearby that are doing them at the same time, they'll show up when you're within the bounds of that area and you'll actually fight together, which is pretty cool. And these can be all sorts of different things, from like huge multi-wave encounters to standing on these pedestals to light up this big obelisk thing to, of course, defending NPCs and some other stuff like that. So there's definitely a good variety of them, and when you complete them, you get this big resplendent chest that slams down in the middle of the area that everyone can open and get their own loot from. The chest tends to drop a lot of gold, as well as some really nice stuff, sometimes even some legendary items, and also some murmuring obols, they're called, which are a special type of coin that you can only hold a certain number of. You can only hold about 500 of them at first, and you need to get very far into the game in order to expand this. But the obols are used for gambling. Basically, you go to a gambling merchant that sells you unidentified items for obols, and sometimes you can even get legendaries and stuff from this as well. So it is actually worth amassing a bunch of these so that you can occasionally gamble them away and buy some really potentially good stuff, but probably not, you never know. Although I actually got really lucky because the first time I ever used this NPC, I actually got a legendary weapon that was quite good for my build, so I used that for a long time actually. There are various story bits as well, of course. I'm not going to spoil any of that with any of the footage in the background. You're not going to see big story fights or anything of that nature, but there is, of course, a main quest line, and this main quest line is split into several different NPCs that you can go and travel to in sort of whatever order you want. And once you start one of those main quest lines, it will sort of lock you into that chain, and you'll have to complete that in order to progress. And each of these chains is multiple quests long, as it sort of, you explore that region of the world and reveal more NPCs and their relations with each other, and then fight some big bosses. And sometimes there's a dungeon in there somewhere. It depends on the quest line. Usually there's some sort of like big important story dungeon near the end of it, and then a really big important story boss fight, complete with cutscenes and all that stuff. So yeah, there's definitely a main storyline here. It's not just a purely open sandbox experience where you're meant to find your own fun. So I do appreciate that there still is a story of some kind. It's not just a pure sandbox. And the story is, it's pretty standard for Diablo. A lot of it will be things you're familiar with if you've played a Diablo story before. It is, at least in my opinion, better than Diablo 3's story. And in fact, I would also say that the game in general is just in a much better state than Diablo 3 was at launch. D3 had a lot of balance issues and a lot of really boring loot and some other problems at launch. This game feels a lot more polished and doesn't have those kinds of boring loot issues or anything like that because of the whole real money auction house fiasco that happened. This is, it just feels like a better product in general, I would say, on launch than D3 did. There's also the world tier system to talk about, which is interesting because it's basically like a form of difficulty, but not quite. You'll notice a little world tier 2 symbol on the right of the screen, and that is sort of like a difficulty. You have two different ones to choose from when you first begin. They're the only two you can actually choose from the start. And world tier 1 is sort of like an easy mode, or I guess you really consider it like normal mode. And then world tier 2, veteran, is a hard mode basically. And in world tier 2 you get some better loot as well as some more experience, but enemies are a lot harder. And personally, I've played World Tier 2 from the beginning, and I found it to be pretty manageable solo, so I would say it's pretty well balanced with a couple of exceptions. Namely, some enemies in dungeons are like blindingly more difficult than the boss fight, which is weird. Sometimes you'll get like a really unlucky roll of modifiers on a normal elite enemy in the dungeon somewhere, and that elite will be more difficult than the boss of that dungeon sometimes. It's a little bit strange when it happens, but it does happen occasionally. And then once you beat the main quest line, you can choose the other difficulties, or world tiers. World tier 3 is called Nightmare, and I believe the fourth one is called Torment. And these aren't just more difficult, but they also unlock new mechanics, like the Hell Tides, which are like incursions from hell that are very difficult looking, but drop very good loot, and including some stuff that you can't get elsewhere. And also, normally in the game, Legendary is the highest rarity that you can drop. Legendary equipment is as high as you can go, but once you get to tier 3 and on, you can actually start dropping unique stuff very rarely, and uniques are basically like supercharged legendaries, more or less. So far, based on the amount I've been able to play, I've really enjoyed my time with Diablo 4 more than I was expecting to. I find it to be in a way better state than D3, and it reminds me a lot of Diablo 2 in some really good ways. And it's, for me right now, a tentative recommend, I would say. I've definitely had enough fun to say that it is worth purchasing if you're really into ARPGs, but I'm also not sure how they're going to do the whole seasons thing and the whole battle pass stuff, and all that's not really available yet, so I can't comment on the fairness and how useful it is to be a completely free-to free-to-play player, which is kind of disgusting to say because this is a game you have to buy to play in the first place. But anyway, yeah, so I can't really comment on any of that nonsense because it's not currently in at the time I'm putting this video up. But that's why I say it's a tentative recommend, because the base game itself, the actual product, aside from all those other business decisions, is a really fun ARPG that's got a ton of really cool environmental variety, some really excellent music and atmosphere, a lot of detail. When it comes to the environments and the graphics in general, it's a very pretty looking game. It is a 90 gigabyte install, so that's a lot of gigabytes, but there's a lot to see here at least, and it is pretty fun so far. So hopefully the future business decisions with the game don't completely destroy it, and it still winds up being a very fun time with a good amount of variety and stuff to keep you busy. So that'll be my look currently at Diablo 4. It's possible that I will make another video in the future once some of this other stuff is in, and once I've had more experience with the other classes and stuff to have more of a rounded opinion. But yeah, for right now, tentative recommend. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'll link you to the main Battle.net store page for this game in the description below this video, and I'll see you guys next time.